For those that don't know, I'm working with ITC on energy report that we do every month or so. We have on the show today, we have ITC Energy Report with Chuck Marshall, the Vice President of Transmission Planning, who's going to be talking to us today about the importance of inter-regional transmission planning and the latest efforts related to long-range transmission planning. And that may be a tad complicated for folks. So why don't you break that down a little bit, Chuck?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for having me. Just to get started here quickly, a little bit about ITC for those folks that maybe don't know about ITC. ITC is an independent transmission company. So what that means in a practical sense is we own the grid. When you think about our industry, there's kind of three components of the grid. There's generation, there's transmission, and then there's distribution. And so ITC's sole focus is transmission. That's a little bit unique when you think about other states, not the state of Michigan, kind of around the country. Often it's one company that owns all three components. In Michigan, ITC just solely owns transmission, which can be challenging at times, but it also has its benefits. And it really is, it's just a pure sort of unadulterated view. So we're not distracted by the distribution system. We're not distracted by the generation. We're just solely pursuing transmission solutions that drive the greatest value to customers. Me specifically, I am the Vice President of Transmission Planning. So I live that transmission planning process sort of day in, day out. Proactively trying to anticipate future system needs and building for it today, not waiting till we get to a point where the system's sort of imploding or falling apart, but rather proactively making investments in the system. So when those needs manifest, we have the infrastructure in place to support it.
Yeah, I know we've had other ITC folks on the show that have talked about it's really a very long-term planning process, like 7 to 10 years out. And of course, now the wild card that's bedeviling your planning is the electric vehicles and how quickly they're going to come online and how many there's going to be and what impact that's going to have on the grid and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a big question mark around EVs and what impact those have on the grid. And that's a little bit further in the future. I mean, clearly the adoption rate, it's starting today. But there's a lot going on in terms of technologies to balance some of that. But what's really impacting the grid in the near term immediately, and thus the reason for this long range transmission plan is just the generation fleet change, right? You've got units that are traditional sort of legacy, dispatchable coal and gas units. Those are retiring at really unprecedented rate. And then you're bringing on these renewable resources, wind and solar in different areas, right? They're not layered right on top of geographically. They're not right close to where those traditional dispatchable units are. So it causes us to think about planning in a slightly different way. And so, yeah, that's where long range transmission plan comes in, is what type of backbone regional infrastructure do we need that's really going to facilitate this transition to cleaner and greener renewable resources.
So one of the questions I was looking at in my notes is when is a good time to start the planning? I guess it's pretty much all the time, right? You have to constantly change.
Absolutely. So we do on an annual basis. We have a planning process that we go through that's more local in nature. And so we look at reliability, we look at age and condition, asset renewal. What MISO's done here with this long range transmission plan in this tranche one of projects, with just a little context on tranche one. So tranche one spans multi-state. So when you think about MISO, and we can talk about MISO here in a minute if you would like, but MISO is responsible for regional planning really across like a 15-state region. So you go as far as the Dakotas, as far east as Michigan. And so there's this portfolio of projects that really took MISO about 2 years to develop, and many, many different stakeholders coming together. It's about $10.3 billion over that multi-state region of transmission investment and infrastructure. And it's a lot of those things that I just mentioned. It's facilitating this clean green future. It's proactively generator interconnection projects. And so in Michigan specifically, there's two projects. There's two LRTP projects, about 110 miles of investment in the state, as well as some reconductor that's going to better prepare the state for this transition.
You're tapping Indiana, if I recall from the press release, right?
Yep. So there's going to be a double circuit 345 kV line that comes through the state, through Indiana, and it's going to go up. So this is all Greenfield. So this is new infrastructure. There's no infrastructure there today. It's going to go up to Calhoun County. There's going to be a substation that we would drop in there. And then it's going to continue to go north from there up into Gratiot County. And then there's a rebuild portion that goes from Calhoun over to Wayne County as well. And so it's about 110 miles of new Greenfield transmission, as well as 75 miles of rebuild. So it's a fair amount to do. Right now we're targeting, you talk about the timing and the need.
Yeah.
We're targeting to get all of these projects in service by 2030, which obviously is many years in the future, 8 years out. So that's kind of the critical nature of this, right? Is we're at this accelerated rate of change in the industry where all these retirements are happening at the same time. And the transmission infrastructure now is trying to catch up to support everything that's happening in the industry.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And just to clarify, just for folks out there that aren't as up to speed as you are, and I try to be, you guys are the big transmission lines that go up a couple 100 feet, and versus say the DTEs and the consumers that generates it. Now, I think you guys also have wind power up in the Thumb area. I don't know if you actually own that or just connected to it, or what's going on up in that area.
Yeah, so we do have a project in the Thumb that was constructed. I think it was placed in service, I want to say 2014, 2015 timeframe, our Thumb Loop project. So we built out infrastructure in that region, and the purpose of that was to integrate primarily wind resources at the time. So we don't own that. You're correct. Like, we are only transmission. So we're in the state of Michigan, 120,000 volts up to 345,000 volts. But it's interesting that you mentioned that Thumb Loop project, because that was the last time that MISO had a regional build out of infrastructure. So we had those MVP projects roughly 10 plus years ago that were approved. And now we've got this long range transmission plan that the need drivers are similar to those MVP projects in terms of access to regional resources and reliability, resiliency. In essence, sort of keeping the lights on is really one of the primary thrust of some of these LRTP projects.
Yeah, it's got to be challenging. There's so many variables all the time, and how many people are going to build houses and where. And seems like with the pandemic and everybody going virtual, a lot of people that were in urban areas are now going more into the more rural areas. How challenging is that for you to figure out?
So it is. It's challenging, and we work very closely with the distribution utilities, right? Because at the end of the day, they actually serve the end use customer. And so that is something that we work through, anticipating load forecast and what those looks like. And again, building infrastructure before it's needed. I would say the most challenging part more for ITC is on the generator interconnection side. As I alluded to before, many of these traditional units are centralized units that are relatively close to load. And now you're retiring those and you're building out new units that are more rural in nature and remote from load. And then just the characteristics are different, right? I mean, dispatchable units, you can basically turn them on, you can call them up and ramp the unit up. Whereas intermittent resources are largely weather dependent. These renewable resources are weather dependent. And so if the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, that's why you need these long range transmission plan, right? This backbone infrastructure, additional backbone infrastructure, so you can reach out to your neighbors and leverage their excess generation. And also the state of Michigan, if we have excess generation, we can support our neighbors as well by pushing some of that generation their way. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think people may not be aware of that. You guys are actually not just in Michigan. You're spread out over what, 5 or 6 states or something like that?
Yeah, many different states. Our primary asset base is Michigan, Iowa, Minnesota, and then we have projects in Kansas and Oklahoma as well. But yeah, MISO really facilitates sort of that regional market, the regional flow of power. And again, with this clean energy transition, you need that regional infrastructure more than ever. And you know, one topic that folks often mention and allude to is just weather and severe weather and these different weather events, right? And one data point that always resonates with me is you go back to Texas, right? And they had that winter storm Uri and they experienced that. Well, after the fact, there's been a report that's been published. And what that report determined was as far east as Pennsylvania and Maryland, they were pushing what's 13 gigs of power. And 13 gigs of power, if you don't have an appreciation for what that is, that's roughly 60% of ITC's Michigan peak load. So on the hottest day of the year, 60% of that load, they were pushing that from PJM into MISO, down into Louisiana, and even beyond to Kansas and Oklahoma. And so absent some of this regional investment that we're talking about, you wouldn't have the ability to push power hundreds and hundreds of miles for that reliability, that resiliency in those extreme cases.
And I think the case of Texas, and correct me if I'm wrong, is they don't really interconnect. They're just Texas is Texas, right? And so I know
They're
bad
on
things.
a little bit of an island. Yes.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I was amazed when I read that. I thought that can't be right. But you can't figure Texans out most of the time. They're very independent. Yeah.
The AC interconnected grid was doing everything in our ability to get power close to Texas, to those regions that needed it. But yes, to your point, it was difficult actually to penetrate and get into Texas because of the nature of how their system is tied to the surrounding system.
Okay. Any other points you want to make that I didn't ask you about? I think we've covered some of the notes, but there might be something else you want to discuss. Anything like that?
Yeah, just maybe specifically, we touched on kind of the scope of the Michigan projects, 110 miles, 75 miles of rebuild. But I think the thing that's important is it's really the benefits that these projects deliver. And MISO's done some analysis. And over the next 20 years, the benefits that are expected to accrue to the state of Michigan are from $6 billion to $9 billion. And that's, again, over that 20-year period. And so it's everything you would think it would be. It's reliability, it's resiliency. It's if we build this infrastructure today, we don't need to build future infrastructure in the future. And the other thing truly is, again, in the media, particularly in 2022, there was a lot of discussions around capacity and resource adequacy. And are we going to have enough power to keep the lights on? It's these types of power, this backbone regional infrastructure that allows us, as I've said, to share and kind of ship power back and forth to keep the lights on when we need it the most. Okay,
sounds great. And how do folks reach out to learn more about ITC Holdings?
So ITC has a website. I believe it's ITC-Holdings.com. So there's information on our website. There's going to be more information about these long-range transmission plans. And there's actually more work to be done. This is tranche one. This is significant. It's a big step forward, but it's not the end of the game. MISO and company are actively working on a tranche two. We're expected to know more in about a year, 12 to 18 months. And so that'll be, to the extent tranche two moves forward, that'll be another big step forward to building this necessary infrastructure.